Imagine this. You're a young woman living in Victorian England, and all you've ever wanted is to be an artist. How do you go about doing this when you're not even allowed to go to art school? What if your only way into this world is to be considered beautiful by influential men? Would you take on the role of Muse and hope that it leads to your dreams? Today, we're going to delve into the story of super muse Elizabeth Eleanor Siddal, who could in some ways be called the world's first supermodel. Sorry, Janice Dickinson. I'm Heidi from the Obsession podcast, where we get highly obsessed with weird things. As always, I'm going to do an illustration of the story, and please wait for the reveal at the end. Lizzie Siddal was born in 1829 to a working-class London family and the third of 8 children. Her father had a cutlery business, and while not living in poverty, the family had to work hard and the children were expected to contribute financially as soon as they could. Legend has it that Lizzie was in the kitchen unwrapping a pat of butter that had been wrapped in a piece of newspaper that happened to have a poem of Tennyson's printed on it. Discovering the existence of poetry changed young Lizzie's life. She's then spent all her time jotting down poetry and drawing. Her health was always fragile, and she was considered somewhat odd-looking. In fact, she was the exact opposite of everything that was considered attractive in Victorian England. Back then, the ideal beauty was short, plump and soft, with delicate features and a rosebud mouth. Lizzie, by contrast, was very tall, very thin, and had extremely bright red hair. Now, anyone who grew up reading Anne of Green Gables knows that red hair back then was a bit of a curse. It wasn't just unfashionable to be a redhead, there were all sorts of associations with immorality when it came to that colour. While the historical links to witchcraft didn't mean so much in the Victorian era, red-headed women still carried a stigma and an association with promiscuity. So, in spite of being everything that Victorian society considered physically undesirable in a woman, Lizzie was so striking that people often felt themselves compelled to stare at her. As well as being an unconventional beauty, Lizzie also had very different interests from most working-class girls of her age. Still obsessed with poetry and art, Lizzie yearned to be amongst artists and intellectuals, and more than anything, she wanted to learn how to draw properly. Now, this would be difficult. Most of the eminent art schools in England did not admit women, and those who did allow a few women in did not allow them to attend life drawing classes and gave them an overall inferior education to their male counterparts. Most of the women who entered art college grounds were models, not students. Now, there are 2 contrasting stories about how Lizzie finally got into the world of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The first is that she was working in a millinery shop when an artist named Walter Deverell saw her and was so captivated by her unworldly looks that he decided to make her his model. The second, and much better story in my opinion, says that Lizzie took herself off to show her drawings to Walter Deverell's father, who was the head of the Government School of Design. So Deverell Sr. was apparently more interested in Lizzie's potential as a model than as an artist, which is how she ended up meeting and posing for his son. Deverell was a friend of the artists of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and Deverell told them that his new model was astoundingly beautiful, magnificently tall, with a lovely figure and the most delicate and finished modelling. I might just quickly explain who the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were. So they were an artistic movement founded in 1848, mostly made up of painters, but also including a few poets. The original members included William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. As their name suggests, they were not fans of Renaissance painter Raphael and believed that his technique had set a bad example for all the painters who came after him. They were heavily inspired by the Romantic movement and believed in the spiritual powers of nature. They rejected the trend of painting scenes of everyday life and instead took inspiration from religion, mythology, and literature. The member of the Brotherhood who would ultimately have the most influence on Lizzie's life was Rossetti, but it was John Everett Millais who created probably the most famous image of her, namely his painting of Ophelia. This much-loved painting of the Shakespearean heroine lying in a river about to sink to her death with flowers strewn about her was what made Lizzie famous, but it also foreshadowed and, in some ways, contributed to her death a few years later. Lizzie had to lie in a bathtub full of water, wearing only the loose silver gown that we see in the painting. Lamps were placed underneath the tub to help keep the water warm, only they went out during the sitting, and Millais was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice, and poor Lizzie was too shy to speak up. She did escape freezing to death, but she did become incredibly ill shortly afterwards. Her father demanded that Millais pay her medical bills, which he did, and although Lizzie survived, her already fragile health never fully recovered. And it was because of this illness that she was given laudanum, an analgesic containing opium, and this was the start of her addiction problems. So, at this stage, Lizzie was fully immersed in the life of the Pre-Raphaelites, and in particular, the life of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who had become her lover and mentor. Lizzie was his muse and modelled exclusively for him, and much to her delight, Lizzie's artistic ambitions were also being realised. Rossetti himself was tutoring her in drawing and painting, and even allowed her to show some of her pieces in the Brotherhood's exhibition. The art critic, John Ruskin, believed in her talent so much that he gave her a yearly allowance of £150 so that she could have the independence to focus on her art studies. Now, as amazing as this sounds, it did mean that Ruskin had some control over her life and her work. And her relationship with Rossetti was troubled from the start. He was moody, constantly unfaithful, and quite frequently very selfish. He might have been willing to teach her how to paint, but ultimately it was his own work that would come first, and her main use to him was as muse and as model. Lizzie's own art was either mocked by the other artists or overlooked. Unlike the male painters in her circle, Lizzie had not had years of formal training, and it showed. Her insecurities about her place in Rossetti's life were also increasing, and for good reason. Even after 10 years together, Rossetti had still not set a wedding date, and he was very easily distracted by the younger models that came into his circle. Realizing that a career as an artist was near impossible for her, and that her role as a muse was likely to be usurped at some point, Lizzie relied heavily on laudanum to get her through the day. Now, the sale of one of her paintings to a well-known art collector from the US gave Lizzie the confidence that she needed to break free from the controlling men in her life. She told Ruskin to cancel her annuity, and she went to Derbyshire for a holiday with one of her sisters. She didn't return to London, instead moving to Sheffield to live in a lodging house and study at the local art school. Good on you, Lizzie. Not much is known of her life there until 1860, when she became terribly ill. On hearing that she was close to death, Rossetti promptly arranged for marriage and turned up at her door because, of course, he did. They did get married, and Lizzie did recover somewhat and even fell pregnant. It looked like they might finally reach a stage of contentment. However, in 1861, Lizzie gave birth to a stillborn daughter, and a subsequent depression worsened her reliance on laudanum. Once, a friend walked in to the heartbreaking sight of Lizzie rocking an empty cradle and asking her not to wake the baby. Early the following year, Rossetti came home from teaching a night class at the Working Men's College and found Lizzie comatose, an empty bottle of laudanum by the bed. Doctors were unable to revive her, and she died during the early hours of the following morning. When she was in her coffin, Rossetti made the grandiose and very Victorian gesture of placing the only manuscript of his unpublished poetry next to Lizzie's cheek so that it could be buried with her as an act of extreme artistic sacrifice. Except 7 years later, he decided he wanted the manuscript back. He was able to have the coffin legally exhumed, but he wasn't present. His agent, Charles Howell, was there, and it seems like Howell had a bit of a literary flair himself, because he claimed that Lizzie's corpse was quite perfect and showed no signs of decay or corruption. And later, the story evolved into the coffin being filled with her amazing hair, which had kept growing years after her death. And now, of course, this was not true, and the manuscript itself was evidence of that. You see, corpses leak, and the manuscript was soaked as well as being full of wormholes. Rossetti was presented with a pile of decaying papers that stank of disinfectant. So he would have been there sitting at his desk transcribing from this corpse juice manuscript that stank to high heaven of disinfectant. And was it worth it? Not according to critics, who absolutely savaged the book on publication, one even comparing it to a cancer. Wow. So, the exhumation of Lizzy Siddal haunted Rossetti for the rest of his life until he died of a kidney ailment at the age of 53. Lizzy Siddal is by far not the only woman who yearned for the life of an artist and got the life of an artist's muse instead. The list seems endless, and it's difficult to wonder what masterpieces the world has missed out on. Well, anyway, I'm going to finish this drawing and I'll put up the finished product when I'm finished. Thank you for joining me. Please like, subscribe to the channel, check out the podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll see you next time for more weirdness. Bye.